Hello, everyone, and welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're taking a fascinating journey far, far back in time. Now, I know when a lot of people think of history, they picture thick, dusty textbooks, right? Just endless lists of dates to memorize. But I want you to completely throw that idea out the window. Seriously. Instead, we're going to reframe the study of our past as what it truly is: an active, thrilling, and ongoing detective investigation. Historians and archaeologists aren't just sitting around reading old stories. They're actively piecing together a massive, complex puzzle left behind by our ancestors.
Okay, so let's dive into this by looking at a perfectly relatable scenario from our source material. There's this girl named Rashida. She's just sitting there reading the newspaper when suddenly her eyes fall on a tiny headline that simply says 100 years ago. And it sparks this fantastic universal question. How can anyone possibly know what happened so many years ago? I mean, think about it. If you want to know what happened yesterday, you just check the news. If you want to know about last year, you ask a friend who remembers it. But what about hundreds or literally thousands of years ago? How do we even begin to map out that ancient crime scene?
Well, to answer that, we first have to look at the ground itself. Just take a look at this map of the subcontinent. As historical detectives, we really need to understand how the physical environment absolutely dictated where our ancestors lived and traveled. Notice the natural frontiers mapped out here. You've got the towering Himalayas to the north, winding river systems like the Indus and the Ganga, the vast deserts, the seas. These geographical features were the ultimate rule makers. Sure, they made journeys incredibly difficult and sometimes dangerous, forcing people to cross tough terrain for trade or military conquest or escaping natural disasters. But these rivers and hills also dictated exactly where early humans could successfully settle down, find fresh water, and ultimately build civilizations.
So let's actually trace this out on a timeline and see how human settlement builds chronologically across that exact geography. We start hundreds of thousands of years ago, right along the banks of the Narmada River. This is where skilled gatherers and hunters basically lived off the immense natural wealth of the surrounding forests. Then, flash forward to about 8,000 years ago, up in the Suleiman and Kirtar Hills to the northwest, a massive shift happens here. Women and men actually begin growing crops, stuff like wheat and barley, and they start rearing animals in villages. Jump forward again to 4,700 years ago, and boom, we see the very first cities flourishing along the Indus River. Finally, by about 2,500 years ago, massive cities and incredibly powerful kingdoms like the mighty Magadha emerged to the south of the Ganga River.
And honestly, this brilliantly illustrates how the very names of our land were shaped by those ancient movements and settlements. We frequently use two words for our country: India and Bharat. Let's break those down. On the left, India is completely geographically rooted. It comes from the river Indus, which was known as Sindhu in ancient Sanskrit. About 2,500 years ago, Iranians and Greeks passing through the northwest got familiar with this river. They called it the Indos or Hindos, and the land to the east just naturally became India. Now on the right, we have Bharat. This name has deep, ancient cultural roots. It originally referred to a specific group of people living in the northwest, who were actually mentioned in the Rig Veda. That's the absolute earliest Sanskrit composition, dating back 3,500 years. Eventually, the name was just used for the entire country.
So, how do we actually know all this? That brings us to our first main section, clues from the past. This is all about gathering the historical evidence.
Now, what's really fascinating here is the dramatic contrast in the types of written records our ancestors left behind for us to find. On the left side, we have manuscripts. The word literally comes from the Latin mano, meaning hand. These were written on extremely fragile palm leaves, or sometimes the specially prepared bark of birch trees from the Himalayas. As you can imagine, over thousands of years, a ton of these were destroyed or just eaten by insects. Though, thankfully, some did survive in temples and monasteries. On the right, however, we have inscriptions. These are completely different. These are writings carved directly into hard, almost imperishable surfaces like stone or metal. Kings absolutely loved these. They used them to record their battle victories or issue permanent orders to their subjects, literally setting their words in stone for millennia to come. But, written records only tell us so much, especially since ordinary people rarely wrote books or carved giant stone monuments. And that is exactly where archaeologists come in. They explore and excavate, which literally means digging under the surface of the earth to find the hard, imperishable objects of everyday survival. We're talking the remains of brick buildings, tools, weapons, ornaments. They dig up baked clay pots and ancient metal coins. They even hunt for tiny, easily missed clues like animal, bird, and fish bones, because those tell us exactly what ancient people had for dinner. They'll even look for incredibly rare charred seeds or burnt wood that somehow managed to survive, giving us vital clues about their farming habits.
Just take a look at this artifact right here. I mean, at first glance, it might just look like a dirty pot, right? But it's actually a direct physical window into a home from 4,700 years ago. Finding an everyday object like this ancient clay pot helps us instantly visualize daily life. Somebody carefully crafted this. Somebody carried water in this. Someone stored their grain in it. When we uncover these physical objects, the past suddenly stops being this abstract concept in a textbook and becomes a tangible human reality.
But gathering the evidence is really only half the battle. We now move to part 2, decoding time and language, basically making sense of the clues. So let's demystify some of the timeline jargon that honestly trips so many of us up. Look at these equivalents. Historically, years were counted from the generally assigned date of the birth of Jesus Christ. Dates before that were labeled BC, or before Christ, and counted backwards. Dates after were labeled AD, which stands for the Latin Anno Domini, meaning in the year of the Lord. Today, though, scholars generally use a more universal secular system. They use BCE for before Common Era and CE for Common Era. This little table perfectly maps it out, so you really never have to mix them up again. Just remember, if you see BCE, you're counting backwards into the deep past.
Okay, so that's time. But what about the writing? Languages and scripts change drastically over time. To read a 2,000-year-old inscription, scholars have to use a fascinating, painstaking process called decipherment. One of the absolute most famous examples of this happened in Rosetta, a town in Egypt. Scholars found a stone with the exact same message written in 3 different scripts, Greek and 2 forms of ancient Egyptian. Because scholars could already read Greek, they noticed something cool. The names of kings were enclosed in little frames called cartouches. By matching the Greek names they already knew to the Egyptian symbols they didn't, they cracked the code. Like, they figured out that the drawing of a lion stood for the letter L, and a bird stood for A. And from there, an entire ancient world just opened up to them.
As we piece together the timeline and translate these ancient scripts, we arrive at the final twist of our historical investigation. Look at the title of the source text we're analyzing today. It's called Our Pasts, plural, with an S at the end. Why isn't it just our past? Well, because the deeper we dig, the more we realize that history isn't just one single unified story. History is actually a massive collection of vastly different experiences all happening at the exact same time. Think about it. The life of a powerful king was completely different from the life of a farmer or a herder. As we can see here, kings and queens were highly visible. They won huge battles, they commanded wealth, and crucially, they paid people to keep detailed records of their victories on those hard stone inscriptions we saw earlier. But what about the ordinary people? You know, the hunters, the fishing folk, the gatherers. They definitely didn't carve stone monuments about their daily chores. Their lives are mostly unknown to us, which is exactly why the physical clues dug up by archaeologists, those pots, the bones, the tools, are so incredibly vital. It's very often the only real clue we have to reconstruct the lives of everyday folk. Which brings us to the very end of our investigation for today, and I want to leave you pondering this final, really provocative question. If history is largely written and recorded by the powerful, whose pasts are we still missing today? The detective work of history is absolutely far from complete. There are still clues buried under the earth, unread scripts, and forgotten voices just waiting to be uncovered. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning everything, keep digging for the truth, and I'll catch you on the next one.